I gripped the steering wheel of Grandpa's old Ford pickup, trying to focus on the gravel road ahead instead of the silence filling the cab. Laurel sat beside me with our camping checklist spread across her lap, methodically checking off items we'd already packed 3 times. The tension from our fight 2 days ago still sat between us like a third passenger. Sleeping bags, check. First aid kit, check. Her voice was deliberately cheerful, the way she got when she was trying to smooth over conflict. "Oh, did you remember the camp stove fuel?" "Blue container in the back," I said, glancing at her sideways. She was wearing that soft pink sweater that made her look like she belonged in a coffee shop, not the Minnesota wilderness. Meanwhile, I'd thrown on my practical flannel and hiking boots, because unlike some people, I actually planned for the environment we'd be in. God, listen to me. Even my thoughts were getting bitchy. The truck hit a pothole and Laurel grabbed the dashboard. Maybe we should have taken my car instead. Grandpa's truck can handle these roads better. I downshifted as we climbed a hill. Besides, he specifically said I could use it for this trip. What I didn't say was that Thomas had spent 20 minutes going over the route with me, pointing out landmarks and warning me about areas to avoid. "Stick to the marked trails, Jay," he'd said, his gray eyes more serious than usual. "Some parts of that forest have old mining operations. Ground can be unstable." At the time, I'd rolled my eyes a little. Now, surrounded by dense trees that seemed to press closer to the road with each mile, his warnings felt less overprotective and more necessary. "I still can't believe your mom's making you move all the way to Portland," Laurel said, abandoning the checklist. "It's so far. Job opportunity of a lifetime, apparently." I tried to keep the bitterness out of my voice. "She says I'll love the Pacific Northwest, mountains and ocean and all that." "Maybe you will. Maybe. But what I really wanted to say was that I didn't care about mountains or oceans. I cared about having my best friend 2 blocks away instead of 2,000 miles. I cared about Thursday movie nights and spontaneous ice cream runs, and all the tiny daily things that made life feel solid." The silence stretched again. I knew we were both thinking about our fight, about the things we'd said about Peter. I'd called him manipulative. She'd accused me of being jealous. Both were probably true, which made everything worse. "There's the forest entrance," Laurel pointed ahead. The Cloquet State Forest sign appeared through the trees, weathered wood with carved letters. I pulled into the small parking area, dust swirling up around the truck. We'd driven past several other camping areas, but Grandpa had recommended this one. Quieter, he'd said, with better hiking trails nearby. Setting up camp took us an hour, falling into the familiar rhythm we'd developed over years of sleepovers turned camping trips. Laurel handled the tent stakes with surprising competence for someone who looked like she belonged in a shopping mall, while I wrestled with the rainfly. Neither of us mentioned that this might be our last camping trip together. Some things were too big to say out loud. "I'll get firewood," I announced once we'd finished. Anything to break the weird politeness that had replaced our usual easy conversation. "I'll come with you." We walked into the forest, collecting dead branches and fallen logs. The trees here were thick, a mix of birch, maple, and pine that filtered the afternoon sunlight into scattered patches. It was beautiful in that wild Minnesota way I'd grown up with, all green shadows and the smell of earth and growing things. "Over here," Laurel called from about 20 yards to my left. "There's a whole dead tree we could use." I followed her voice through the underbrush, stepping over roots and pushing aside low-hanging branches. But when I reached the spot where she stood, I stopped dead. Oh God. A deer carcass hung from a thick branch about 8 feet off the ground, suspended by what looked like rope around its hind legs. But this wasn't some hunter's normal field dressing. The animal had been opened from throat to belly with surgical precision, its organs completely removed, leaving behind an empty cavity that yawned dark and wrong. The cuts were too clean, too deliberate, and arranged around the base of the tree in a perfect circle were the missing organs: heart, liver, lungs, placed on flat stones like some kind of offering. Laurel pressed her hand over her mouth. Is that normal? Do hunters do that? I'd been hunting with Thomas since I was 12. I knew what normal field dressing looked like. This wasn't it. We should go, I said, backing away from the tree. The smell was starting to hit me, not just decomposition, but something metallic and sharp that made my stomach turn. Maybe someone was just... Laurel, I grabbed her arm. We're going now. We hurried back to our campsite, not talking about what we'd seen, but both walking faster than necessary. When we reached our tent, I started pulling up stakes without explanation. What are you doing? Moving our camp. I yanked the tent fabric free and began folding it with sharp, efficient movements. Somewhere else, away from that. Laurel didn't argue. She helped me pack everything back into our gear bags, and we loaded the truck again. Neither of us wanted to say how much the deer had spooked us. Neither of us wanted to admit that the precise cuts and arranged organs looked less like hunting and more like ritual. We drove deeper into the forest, following a narrower dirt track until we found another clearing about a mile away. This one felt better somehow, more open, with a small stream running along one side. No dead animals hanging from trees. No circles of organs on stones. This is good, Laurel said as we started setting up camp again. I nodded, but I couldn't shake the image of those 2 perfect cuts. Whatever had been done to that deer, it wasn't random. Someone had taken their time, followed some kind of pattern. The question was why, and whether they were still around. The campfire crackled between us, sending sparks up into the star-filled sky. I'd built it bigger than necessary, partly because I wanted to see clearly into the tree line, and partly because the flames felt like a barrier against whatever had left that deer strung up like a sick art project. Remember when we tried to make s'mores with those terrible diet marshmallows? I asked, stabbing a regular marshmallow with a stick. They just melted into nothing. Laurel laughed, but it sounded forced. Your mom was so mad when we used up all her graham crackers anyway. I glanced at her across the fire. She kept checking her phone, even though we both knew there was no signal out here. The blue light made her face look ghostly each time the screen lit up. Expecting an important call from someone? I asked, trying to keep my voice light. She shoved the phone back in her pocket. No, just habit, I guess. We fell quiet again. I wanted to ask about our fight, about the things we'd both said about Peter. But every time I tried to form the words, they felt too big for the space between us. Instead, I focused on rotating my marshmallow, watching the outside turn golden brown. Jay? Laurel's voice was smaller than usual. Can I tell you something? Always? She poked at the fire with her stick, sending up a shower of orange sparks. I've been thinking about breaking up with Peter. I tried not to let my relief show on my face. Oh, how long have you been thinking about it? Weeks, maybe longer. She pulled her knees up to her chest. I just don't know how to do it without completely destroying him, you know? He gets so intense about everything. That was one way to put it. I'd watched Peter's face during their arguments, seen how he'd twist Laurel's words until she was apologizing for things that weren't her fault. But saying that would sound like I was gloating. You don't owe him a relationship just because breaking up might hurt his feelings, I said instead. I know that. Logically, I know that. She sighed. But he keeps talking about all these plans for next year, about visiting me at college, and when I try to change the subject, he acts like I'm being mean to him. I wanted to say that was exactly the kind of manipulative behavior I'd been worried about, but Laurel was finally talking to me about this. Really talking, not just defending him out of reflex. I didn't want to ruin it by being right too loudly. You don't have to figure it all out tonight, I said. Just, trust yourself, okay? You're not responsible for managing his emotions. She nodded, staring into the flames. I've missed this. Talking to you about real stuff. Me too. And I had. These past few months, every conversation had felt like it was happening around Peter-shaped obstacles, things we couldn't say because they might get back to him, or because Laurel would feel guilty for complaining about her boyfriend to me. A log shifted in the fire, sending up another burst of sparks. Somewhere in the forest, a branch cracked loudly, like something heavy had stepped on it. We both looked toward the sound, but the darkness beyond our fire was too thick to see anything. Probably just a deer, Laurel said. Yeah, probably. But I thought about the deer we'd found earlier, hanging from that tree like someone's twisted idea of decoration. I pulled my legs up onto the log I was sitting on, suddenly not wanting my feet on the ground. Another sound drifted through the trees, a low call that might have been an owl but didn't quite match any bird I knew. It came from the opposite direction of the first noise, like something was moving around us in a wide circle. Should we put the fire out? Laurel whispered. I considered it. A big fire made us visible to anything in the forest, but it also meant we could see what was coming. And right now, seeing felt more important than hiding. Not yet. The sound stopped. The forest went unnaturally quiet. No insects, no rustling leaves. Even the stream beside our campsite seemed to muffle itself. That kind of silence meant predator. Every animal for half a mile had gone still and hidden. Jay. Laurel's voice was barely audible. Something's watching us. I felt it too. That crawling sensation between my shoulder blades, like being studied by something with too much attention and not enough good intentions. I reached for the camping knife Thomas had insisted I pack, sliding it out of its sheath and keeping it low beside my leg. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, circling our campsite just outside the reach of the firelight. They moved with the steady rhythm of someone walking upright, not the unpredictable gait of an animal. Hello? I called out, surprised by how steady my voice sounded. Someone there? The footsteps stopped. We should get in the tent, Laurel said. I nodded, and we both stood up carefully, trying not to make sudden movements. The fire would keep burning for a while without us feeding it, and maybe whatever was out there would lose interest and move on. We backed toward our tent, keeping our eyes on the tree line. I held the tent flap open for Laurel, then slipped inside after her, zipping it closed as quietly as possible. My hands were shaking now that we were sitting still. Can you see anything? I whispered. Laurel pressed her face close to the tent wall. Oh God, Jay. There's someone standing right there. I looked where she was pointing. Through the thin nylon, I could make out a tall shadow maybe 10 feet away. Definitely human-shaped, definitely too close. Hey. The voice was familiar, bright and cheerful. Laurel? Jay? It's me. Peter. Relief flooded through me so fast I felt dizzy. Just Peter, probably trying to be romantic or surprising Laurel with some grand gesture. I started to reach for the tent zipper, then stopped. Peter? Laurel called back. What are you doing here? I wanted to surprise you. Sorry if I scared you guys. I was trying to find your campsite without waking you up. He laughed, and it sounded exactly like him. "Can I come in? It's freezing out here." Laurel looked at me with relief and exasperation mixed together. He must have followed us somehow, or tracked my phone before we lost signal. But something was bothering me, a detail that didn't fit. "Peter," I called out, "how did you know where to find us?" "What do you mean?" "We didn't tell you exactly where we were camping. We said the state forest, but there are like 20 different camping areas." Silence. Then his laugh again, but it sounded less natural this time, more practiced. "Lucky guess. I just drove around until I saw your fire." That made sense, except we'd passed 3 other campsites on our way in, all of them closer to the main road than ours. Why would he check this one first? I unzipped the tent flap a few inches and peered out. Peter stood in the ring of firelight, wearing dark jeans and a jacket I didn't recognize. His usual confident smile was there, but something about it looked wrong. Too wide, like he was concentrating on holding the expression. "Hi, Jay," he said when he saw me. "Sorry for being so weird. I was just trying to be mysterious and romantic." The smile got even wider. "You know how it is." I didn't know how it was. Peter had never struck me as the mysterious romantic type. He was more of a grand gesture, center of attention type. Showing up unannounced at our girls' trip seemed more like possessive checking up than romance. "You need to leave," I said, stepping out of the tent with the knife still in my hand. "Right now." "Jay!" Laurel scrambled out behind me. "Don't be rude." "This is our trip, Peter, our last trip before I move. And you just show up without asking?" His smile faltered for the first time. "I thought you'd be happy to see me." "I'm not happy," I said. "I'm calling the police if you don't get back in your car and leave." "Jay, what the hell?" Laurel stepped between us. He drove all the way out here, but something in Peter's expression had changed. The forced smile was gone, replaced by something calculating and cold. He looked at me like he was trying to solve a problem, figure out what approach would work better. "You're right," he said finally. "I should have called first. I'll head back to town." He turned and walked toward the trees, moving with that same measured pace we'd heard circling our campsite. No stumbling in the dark, no flashlight beam bobbing ahead of him. Just confident steps into the black forest, like he could see perfectly well. "Wait," Laurel called after him. "Where's your car?" But Peter was already gone, swallowed by the darkness between the trees. We stood there listening, waiting for the sound of an engine starting up somewhere on the access road. It never came. The morning sun felt different on my face when I crawled out of the tent, like it was trying to wash away whatever weirdness had happened the night before. Laurel was already up, sitting on a fallen log with her hair in a messy bun, poking at the cold ashes of our fire with a stick. "Sleep okay?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. I'd heard her tossing around all night, probably replaying Peter's surprise visit as much as I was. "Not really." She looked up at me with tired eyes. "I keep thinking about what you said, about him just showing up without asking." I sat down beside her, pulling my flannel tighter against the morning chill. "You don't have to defend him to me, you know. Not anymore." "I know." She was quiet for a moment. "The thing is, you were right. About him being possessive. It's been getting worse lately." Something in her voice made me pay attention. "Worse how?" "Like, he'll text me constantly when we're not together. And if I don't respond fast enough, he gets this tone." She shrugged, but I could see the tension in her shoulders. "Then he'll show up at my house or my job, saying he was just worried about me, making me feel guilty for not answering." That sounded exactly like Peter, creating problems so he could solve them, making himself the hero of every situation. That's not normal, Laurel. I know that now. She stood up and brushed off her jeans. God, I can't believe I defended him to you. I was so worried about hurting his feelings that I didn't even think about how his behavior was affecting mine. This was the most honest conversation we'd had in months. I wanted to stay right here and hash out everything that had been building between us, but the forest felt too quiet around our campsite, too empty after last night's weirdness. Want to go for a hike? I asked. Get some distance from here? She nodded immediately. Yes, I need to move. We packed water bottles and granola bars into my day pack, then started following what looked like an old logging trail that curved away from our campsite. The path was overgrown, but still visible, marked by the occasional boot print in the soft earth. I should have listened to you about Peter months ago, Laurel said as we walked. You saw right through him. I was also kind of a bitch about it. You were protecting me. There's a difference. She stepped over a fallen branch. I hate confrontation so much. It's easier to make excuses for someone than to actually deal with their behavior. The trail wound through thick stands of birch and maple, their leaves filtering the sunlight into moving patterns on the forest floor. This felt better than sitting around camp thinking about Peter's too wide smile and the way he'd walked into the darkness like he owned it. You know what the worst part is? Laurel continued. I've been scared to break up with him. Actually scared. He gets so intense when he's upset, and I kept thinking if I just handled it the right way, he'd be reasonable about it. People who are reasonable don't make you scared to leave them. Exactly. She paused to take a drink of water. I kept telling myself I was being dramatic, but then last night happened. Who does that? Who just shows up at someone's camping trip without asking? Someone who doesn't think your boundaries matter, I thought. But Laurel was already figuring that out on her own. We'd been walking for over an hour when I realized I hadn't seen any trail markers in a while. The path we'd been following seemed to branch and split without any clear indication of which direction led where. Hey, I said, stopping. Do you remember passing that big dead tree before? Laurel looked around, frowning. I don't think so. But there are a lot of dead trees. That was the problem. The Minnesota forest in this area was dense and repetitive, without the kind of distinctive landmarks that made navigation easy. One cluster of birch trees looked pretty much like another. One rocky outcropping could be any rocky outcropping. I pulled out my phone, hoping the GPS might work despite the lack of signal. The screen showed a generic map with no current location marked. We were officially in the middle of nowhere. Which way do you think? Laurel asked, but her voice had taken on a tight edge that meant she was starting to worry. I looked back the way we'd come, trying to remember if we'd taken a left or right at the last fork. Everything looked the same. Dense green forest in every direction, no clear path leading anywhere specific. Let's try retracing our steps, I said, hoping I sounded more confident than I felt. We turned around and started walking back, but within 20 minutes it became obvious that we were guessing. The trail we'd been following seemed to disappear entirely, replaced by game paths that led in circles through the underbrush. Jay. Laurel's voice was small. I think we're lost. The sun was definitely lower than it had been when we started hiking. Not sunset yet, but getting there. And we had no idea which direction would take us back to our campsite. It's okay, I said, though it wasn't. We just need to find the main trail again. But after another hour of walking in what I hoped was the right direction, we hadn't found anything resembling a main trail. Just more trees, more undergrowth, more identical-looking forest stretching in every direction. "This is my fault," I said, stopping in a small clearing to catch my breath. I suggested going off trail. We both agreed to it. Laurel sat down on a rock, but she was looking around with the kind of wide-eyed alertness that meant she was fighting off panic. My dad always said if you get lost in the woods, you should stay in one place and wait for help. That works if people know where to look for you. I checked my phone again. Still no signal. Nobody knows exactly where we went hiking. The words hung in the air between us, heavy with the implications we were both trying not to think about. We could wander around out here for days without finding our way back. People died in the Minnesota wilderness every year, usually from exposure or dehydration, often within miles of roads or campsites. There. Laurel pointed past a thick stand of pine trees. "Is that a building?" I looked where she was pointing and saw a flash of something too straight and angular to be natural. We pushed through the trees and found ourselves in a larger clearing where an old house stood, its windows boarded up with weathered plywood and its roof partially collapsed on one side. The place looked like it had been abandoned for decades. The wooden siding was gray and rotting, and weeds grew up through the porch steps. But there was something else. Fresh tire tracks in the dirt leading right up to the front door. "Hello," I called out, walking closer to the building. "Anyone there?" No response, just the sound of wind moving through the damaged roof. "Those tracks look recent," Laurel said, pointing to the clear impressions left by what looked like a pickup truck. "Someone's been here." I stared at the tracks, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The house looked like it had been empty for decades, but the tire marks were definitely fresh, maybe a day or two old at most. "Should we go in?" Laurel asked. "Maybe there's someone inside who can help us get back." I approached the front door, noting that while the windows were boarded up, the door itself was just closed, not blocked. The tire tracks led right up to it, like someone had driven here recently and gone inside. "Hello?" I called again, louder this time. "We're lost hikers. Can anyone help us?" Still no answer, but the door was right there, and we were lost in the middle of nowhere with the sun starting to sink through the trees. I pushed against the door, and it gave way with a groan of warped wood that made my teeth ache. The smell hit us immediately. Sweet decay mixed with something metallic and sharp, like pennies left in the rain. "God, what is that?" Laurel covered her nose with her sleeve. The interior looked like someone had walked away mid-conversation decades ago. Dust sheets covered furniture in the main room, and faded photographs hung on the walls. Families in old-fashioned clothes, kids in sailor suits, women with victory roll hairstyles. But scattered between the antique furniture were things that definitely didn't belong in an abandoned farmhouse from the 1940s. Modern camping gear was piled in one corner. A brand new Coleman stove, still in its packaging. Sleeping bags that looked like they'd come straight from REI. And in the center of the room, someone had cleared away the dust sheets from a small table and arranged maybe a dozen carved wooden figures on it like some kind of altar. "This is so weird," Laurel whispered, moving closer to examine them. Each figure was different but similar, about 6 inches tall, carved from dark wood, depicting something that wasn't quite human and wasn't quite animal. They had elongated faces with too many teeth, and their proportions were all wrong, like someone had tried to carve a person from memory and gotten the details confused. "Jay, look at this." I turned to see Laurel standing by the far wall, where someone had pinned up a detailed topographical map. Our current location was marked with a red X, but there were other marks scattered throughout the forest. Blue circles, black triangles, each one labeled with dates going back 3 years. March 15th, 2021. Northeast Trail, 2 subjects. Laurel read from a note stuck to the map. October 3rd, 2021. Campsite 7, single male. J. These are all different places in the forest. Different handwriting for each note, like multiple people had been adding to this map over time. My skin crawled as I realized what we were looking at. "Those aren't just random dates," I said. "Someone's been tracking people." A kitchen opened off the main room, and I wandered in there while Laurel continued studying the map. The cabinets were mostly empty, but I found a notebook hidden in the back of a drawer, wrapped in plastic like someone wanted to keep it safe from moisture. The first entry was dated 3 years ago. Found tracks again near the old mining road. Same pattern as before. Drag marks leading into the deep forest. Then nothing. Sheriff says it's just animals, but animals don't arrange bones in perfect circles. I flipped through more pages, my hands shaking as I read. Detailed accounts of animal mutilations, people disappearing from marked trails, and something the writer kept referring to as the guardian of the old places. Each entry was more disturbing than the last, describing ritualistic killings and evidence that suggested something was hunting in these woods, systematically. The most recent entry was dated just 2 days ago. New visitors in the eastern sector. Young, inexperienced. The guardian is stirring again. Left offerings at the marked trees to appease it, but I fear it won't be enough this time. Laurel. My voice came out as a croak. We need to get out of here. Now. What did you find? Before I could answer, a loud crash echoed from somewhere above us. Something heavy hitting the floor, followed by a dragging sound that moved slowly across the ceiling from one side of the house to the other. We both froze, staring up at the water-stained ceiling. The dragging sound paused directly above us, then continued toward what must have been the staircase. "We're not alone," Laurel whispered. I shoved the notebook into my pocket and grabbed a heavy flashlight from the pile of camping gear. Laurel picked up one of the carved figures, clutching it against her chest like a talisman. The dragging sound had stopped, replaced by a silence that felt deliberate and listening. Like whatever was up there was waiting for us to make the next move. "We should leave," I said. But even as the words left my mouth, I knew we couldn't. Not yet. Someone had been using this house as a base of operations, tracking people in the forest, and we were probably on their list now. We needed to know what we were dealing with. The staircase was narrow and steep, its wooden steps worn smooth by decades of use. I tested the first step with my foot, and it creaked loudly in the silence. "Maybe we should call for help," Laurel suggested. "With what? Our phones don't work out here." I started climbing, keeping the flashlight ready. Besides, help might not get here in time. The stairs groaned under our weight, but they held. Halfway up, I could see a hallway stretching toward the back of the house, with several doors branching off it. The smell was stronger here, that metallic sweetness mixed with something else I couldn't identify. We reached the top of the stairs and stood there listening. Nothing. No dragging sounds, no footsteps, no breathing. Just the kind of absolute quiet that made your ears ring. "Which way?" Laurel asked. I pointed the flashlight down the hallway. At the far end, one door stood slightly ajar, and I could see dark stains on the wooden floor leading toward it like a trail. I pointed the flashlight toward the trail of dark stains and started following them down the hallway. Each step felt like crossing some invisible line I'd never be able to uncross. "Maybe we should go back," Laurel whispered behind me. But I kept walking. The stains were definitely blood, dark brown and thick, like whoever had bled here had done a lot of it. They led straight to the door at the end of the hall, the one that stood slightly open. I pushed it with my foot, keeping the flashlight ready. The smell hit us first. that metallic sweetness cranked up to 11, mixed with something rotten that made my throat close up. Laurel gagged behind me, but I forced myself to look into the room. Peter lay on what used to be a bed, his body torn open from throat to pelvis. His chest cavity was completely empty, just like the deer we'd found hanging from the tree. But worse. So much worse. Someone had taken their time with him, carving symbols into the walls using his blood, spirals and angular marks that looked almost like writing. His skull was partially caved in on one side, but his face was mostly intact. Same brown hair, same white sneakers I'd seen him wearing at our campsite. The colorful friendship bracelet Laurel had made him last month was still tied around his wrist. Laurel's scream came out strangled and raw. The wooden figure slipped from her hands and shattered on the floor, pieces scattering under the old furniture. "That's not possible," she kept saying. "That's not possible. We saw him last night. We talked to him." I backed away from the doorway, fighting the urge to throw up. The smell was everywhere now, coating the inside of my mouth and nose, but my brain was working through the timeline, adding up details I didn't want to understand. The blood on the walls was dry. The body had started to smell. Peter had been dead for at least a day, maybe longer. So what the hell had visited our campsite last night? A loud bang echoed from downstairs, the front door slamming shut. "Laurel," Peter's voice called from the main room. "Jay, I saw your flashlight. Are you up there?" We both froze. That cheerful, familiar tone drifted up through the floorboards while Peter's actual body lay mutilated 10 feet away from us. "I know you're scared," the voice continued, "but I can explain everything. Come down and we'll talk." Footsteps moved across the floor below us, slow and deliberate, but with a weird shuffling quality that made my skin crawl, like someone walking in shoes that didn't quite fit. "We need to get out of here," I whispered, grabbing Laurel's arm. She was staring at the broken wooden figure, her face completely white. "Those pieces are moving." I looked down and saw she was right. The scattered fragments were slowly sliding across the floor toward each other, like they were magnetized. A couple of the larger pieces were actually steaming. The footsteps had reached the staircase. Each step creaked as something climbed toward us, accompanied by that voice calling our names with perfect Peter inflection. "Window," I said, pulling Laurel toward the far wall. The glass was grimy but unbroken, and the latch turned easily. I shoved it open and looked down. We were above a single-story section of the house, maybe an 8-foot drop to the roof below. "I can't," Laurel whispered. "I can't jump." "Yes, you can." I grabbed one of the broken wooden pieces from the floor. It was warm and had a sharp, jagged edge that felt solid in my hand. "You go first. I'm right behind you." The footsteps had reached the top of the stairs. Whatever was making them paused in the hallway, and I could hear it breathing. Except the breathing was wrong too. Too deep, with a whistling sound like air moving through a broken pipe. "Laurel? Jay?" The voice was right outside the door now. "Don't be afraid. I just want to see you." Laurel swung her leg over the windowsill and jumped. I heard her land on the roof below with a thud and a small cry of pain. I climbed out after her just as the bedroom door opened fully behind me. In the reflection of the window glass, I caught a glimpse of something tall and wrong moving into the room. Human-shaped but stretched in places that didn't make sense, like someone wearing an ill-fitting costume. I dropped down onto the roof and rolled, my knees taking most of the impact. Laurel was already sliding toward the edge, and I grabbed her hand to stop her from going over. "The ground," she said, pointing down. "Another 8-foot drop to dirt and dead leaves. We could make it." Above us, Peter's voice was still calling from the bedroom window. "Please don't run. We need to talk about what you saw." I looked up and saw a dark shape leaning out of the window. In the dying light, it looked like Peter from a distance, but it moved wrong, tilting its head at an angle that would have broken a human neck. "Jump," I told Laurel. We hit the ground hard and started running toward the tree line. Behind us, something crashed through the window we'd just escaped from, landing on the roof with an impact that shook the whole house. The forest was getting dark fast, and I couldn't see more than a few feet ahead, but I could hear whatever was behind us moving through the trees, not running like a person would, but covering ground with a weird, loping gait that seemed to eat up distance. We ran blindly through the underbrush, branches tearing at our clothes and faces. The broken piece of wooden figure was still clutched in my hand, getting warmer by the minute. All I could think about was Peter's empty chest cavity and the thing that had been wearing his voice like a mask. We crashed through the forest like panicked animals, branches whipping across our faces and tearing at our clothes. Behind us, something moved through the trees with that horrible loping rhythm. Too fast, too fluid, like it wasn't bound by the same physical laws that made us stumble over roots and duck under low-hanging branches. My lungs burned, but I kept running. The wooden fragment cut into my palm where I gripped it, and I realized it was getting warmer. Not just warm from my body heat, but actually hot, like it had been sitting in the sun all day. Laurel caught her foot on something and went down hard. I spun around and hauled her up, listening for sounds of pursuit. The forest had gone quiet again. No rustling leaves, no breaking branches, just that terrible waiting silence. "This way," I whispered, pulling her toward a thick clump of birch trees. We squeezed into the center of the thicket, pressing ourselves against the damp ground and trying to slow our breathing. The smell of rotting leaves filled my nose, but it was better than that metallic stench from the house. Through the tangle of branches, I could see patches of starlight, enough to navigate by if we were careful. Thomas had taught me the basics. Find the North Star. Use it to get your bearings. Our campsite was southeast of the house, maybe a mile and a half. Something moved in the darkness beyond our hiding spot. Footsteps, but wrong somehow. Too deliberate, like each step was being planned in advance. "Jay? Laurel?" Peter's voice drifted through the trees, but it sounded different now. Stilted, like someone reading from a script. "I know you're out there. We need to talk about what happened." Laurel pressed her face against my shoulder, her whole body shaking. "You don't understand what you saw," the voice continued. "That wasn't me in the house. That was something else. Something that wanted you to think I was dead." I bit down on my lip to keep from making noise. The creature was maybe 30 feet away, moving in a slow circle around our hiding spot. "Remember when we were kids, Laurel? Remember the fort we built behind your house when we were 8? You made me promise never to tell anyone about the time you wet your pants because you were too scared to leave during that thunderstorm." My blood went cold. Peter hadn't known Laurel when they were 8. He'd moved to town when they were sophomores. But somehow this thing knew about a memory from years before they'd even met. "And Jay," the voice shifted direction, like it was looking right at us through the branches. "Remember what you wrote in your diary about wishing your dad would come back? About how you practiced what you'd say to him if he ever called?" I'd never told anyone about that diary, not even Laurel. I'd burned it 3 years ago. "You've been watching us," Laurel whispered, so quietly I almost didn't hear her. The footsteps stopped. "I've been taking care of you," Peter's voice said, but the tone was completely flat now. No pretense of emotion. "Making sure you were safe. Making sure nothing bad happened to you. Until now," I breathed. A branch snapped, much closer than before, maybe 10 feet away. "My grandmother used to tell stories," Laurel whispered against my ear, "about things that wore dead people's faces, wendigos. They could copy voices, memories, everything, but they were always hungry." The wooden fragment in my hand was almost too hot to hold now. When I shifted it slightly, trying to ease the burn against my palm, it seemed to pulse like it had its own heartbeat. "I can smell you," the voice said, and now it didn't sound like Peter at all, just something pretending to be human. Sweet and warm and alive. The footsteps started moving away, circling wider through the forest. We waited until we couldn't hear them anymore before crawling out of the thicket. "North Star," I whispered, pointing up through the canopy. "That way is north. Our campsite should be southeast." We moved as quietly as we could, stopping every few minutes to listen. The wooden fragment stayed hot in my hand, but I noticed something weird. When I pointed it in certain directions, it seemed to vibrate slightly, like a compass needle trying to find magnetic north. It took us 2 hours to find our way back, moving in careful bursts between patches of thick cover. When we finally saw the pale outline of our tent in the moonlight, I almost cried with relief. Then I saw the state of our campsite. Our supplies were scattered everywhere. The cooler had been torn open, food containers shredded, and their contents spread across the ground. Our sleeping bags had been pulled out of the tent and ripped apart, filling the air with synthetic stuffing that looked like snow in the darkness. "The keys," Laurel said, rushing toward the picnic table where we'd left them. "Gone. Along with both our phones, which we'd stupidly left charging in the truck." I held up the wooden fragment, and in the pale moonlight I could see symbols carved into its surface that definitely hadn't been there before. Or maybe they had been, and I just hadn't noticed. They seemed to shimmer slightly, like they were carved just beneath the surface of the wood. "We're stuck here," Laurel said. "Not stuck," I said, though my voice shook. "Trapped." The fragment pulsed in my hand, and I realized the symbols weren't glowing. They were reflecting something. I turned around slowly, following the direction of the strongest heat. Something stood at the edge of the tree line, perfectly still. Human-shaped but wrong in every detail. Too tall, arms hanging at the wrong angles, head tilted like it was trying to figure us out. It raised one hand and waved at us with Peter's cheerful voice. "Hi, girls. Miss me?" We scrambled into the tent and zipped it shut like that thin nylon could actually protect us from whatever was standing at the edge of our campsite. I kept the wooden fragment clutched in my fist, feeling it pulse with heat against my palm. "Turn off the flashlight," I whispered to Laurel. "Save the battery." The darkness was complete. We sat pressed against each other in the center of the tent, listening to every sound from outside. Wind in the trees, a distant owl, normal forest noises that should have been comforting, but just made me more aware of what wasn't normal about the thing pretending to be Peter. "What do we do?" Laurel's voice was barely a breath. I didn't have an answer. We had no keys, no phones, no way to call for help. The creature was faster than us, stronger than us, and knew things it shouldn't know. All we had was a broken piece of wood that somehow made it back away. Hours crawled by. My legs cramped from sitting still, but I was afraid to move. The wooden fragment stayed warm in my hand, sometimes getting hotter when I shifted it in certain directions, like it was reacting to something out there. Around 3 in the morning, I heard the slow rasp of our tent zipper being pulled down from the outside. We both froze. The zipper moved inch by inch, creating a widening gap that let in cool night air and the faint smell of decay. "Jay? Laurel?" Peter's voice soft and concerned. "I know you're scared, but you don't need to hide from me. Come out so we can talk." I pointed the wooden fragment toward the tent entrance. Immediately, Peter's voice cut off with a sound like static electricity. Then came something else. Clicking noises like someone snapping their fingers really fast, mixed with a low humming that vibrated in my chest. "What the hell?" Laurel whispered. The clicking got louder, more agitated. Then it stopped completely, replaced by a shriek so high-pitched it felt like needles in my ears. We both clapped our hands over our heads, but the sound went right through our palms. When it finally ended, we heard heavy footsteps moving away from the tent, fast, like something retreating. "It's afraid of this thing," I said, holding up the fragment. We waited in silence for maybe 10 minutes before the voices started. "Girls, are you okay in there?" My mother's voice, worried and familiar. "Jay, honey, your grandfather sent me to find you." I almost answered. The voice was perfect, every inflection exactly right, down to the way Mom always called me honey when she was stressed. But my mother was 300 miles away in Minneapolis. "Don't," I breathed to Laurel. "Laurel, it's Emma." Her sister's voice now, younger and more urgent. "Mom and Dad are freaking out. They sent me to get you. Just come out, okay?" Laurel's hand found mine in the darkness and squeezed tight. Emma was away at college in Wisconsin. The thing kept trying. Different voices, different approaches. Laurel's dad, her best friend from middle school, my 8th grade math teacher for some reason. Each time I pointed the wooden fragment toward the sound, and each time the voice cut off with that horrible static click combination. Then it tried Thomas's voice. "Jay, sweetheart, I'm here with the search team." The gravelly tone was absolutely perfect, complete with the slight wheeze he got when he was tired. "We've been looking for you all night. Your mother's worried sick." That one almost broke me. But I remembered what the creature had said earlier about my diary, about private things nobody should know. If it could steal memories, it could steal voices too. I held the fragment steady, and Thomas's voice dissolved into angry clicking sounds. The creature spent the rest of the night circling our campsite. I could track its movement by the way the wooden fragment heated up as it passed different points around our tent. Sometimes, it got close enough that I could hear it breathing, that wrong, whistling sound like air moving through broken pipes. But it never tried to get inside again. Whatever the fragment was, whatever power it held, the thing was genuinely afraid of it. As the sky started getting lighter, the sounds finally stopped. I heard something large moving through the forest, away from our campsite, branches breaking as it retreated deeper into the trees. "Is it gone?" Laurel whispered. "I think so." We waited until full daylight before unzipping the tent. Our campsite looked even worse in the morning sun, deep gouges in the bark of surrounding trees like something had been testing its claws. A trail of black fluid led from our fire pit toward the forest, disappearing into the underbrush. The wooden fragment had gone cool and ordinary looking again, just a broken piece of carved wood with some symbols that could have been decorative. Then I heard it, the distant thrum of helicopter rotors. "Do you hear that?" Laurel grabbed my arm. The sound got louder, more distinct. A search helicopter, flying in a grid pattern over the forest. I ran to the middle of our clearing and started waving my arms, yelling at the top of my lungs. The helicopter circled twice before heading off, probably to radio our location to ground teams. Within an hour, we'd be found. We'd be safe. But as I watched the aircraft disappear over the trees, I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had been hunting us wasn't really gone. Just waiting. The wooden fragment sat heavy in my pocket, and I wondered what my grandfather was going to say when I told him what we'd found in these woods. The voices reached us through the trees first. Thomas calling my name with that particular edge he got when he was trying to stay calm but wasn't really succeeding. I scrambled out of the tent and started yelling back, waving my arms even though I knew they couldn't see me yet through the forest. "Here! We're here!" It took them maybe 15 minutes to reach our clearing, following the sound of my voice. Thomas emerged first through the underbrush, moving faster than I'd seen him move in years, his face cycling through relief and horror as he took in the destroyed campsite. 2 deputies followed behind him, along with a woman I didn't recognize, Native American, probably in her 60s, wearing practical hiking clothes and carrying what looked like a leather satchel. "Jesus Christ," Thomas breathed, looking at the shredded supplies scattered everywhere. Then he was pulling me into a hug that smelled like coffee and flannel and safety. "Are you hurt? Either of you?" "We're okay," I said, though my voice came out shaky. "But Thomas, something happened. Something really bad." He held me at arm's length, studying my face. "Tell me." So I tried. The words tumbled out in a rush. The deer carcass hanging from the tree, Peter showing up at our campsite, the abandoned house with the map and the tracking notes, finding Peter's body carved up like the deer, the thing that wore his voice and knew things it shouldn't know. I pulled the wooden fragment from my pocket, and Thomas's entire expression changed when he saw it. "Where did you get this?" His voice went very quiet. "From the house. There were these carved figures on a table, and when we ran, Laurel dropped one and it broke. This piece. It got hot whenever that thing came near us, like it was warning us." Thomas took the fragment from my hands, turning it over to examine the symbols carved into its surface. The woman with the leather satchel moved closer, and I caught her sharp intake of breath when she saw what he was holding. "Thomas," she said, "that's authentic. Pre-contact work, I'd say. Definitely protective." "Girls, this is Gwen Martin," Thomas said, though he didn't look away from the wooden piece. "She's a historian, specializes in local tribal culture. Gwen, this is my granddaughter, Jay, and her friend, Laurel." One of the deputies was taking pictures of our campsite, documenting the damage. The other was on his radio, calling in what sounded like a request for forensic teams and additional personnel. Laurel spoke up for the first time since the search team arrived. "Was he really—" She couldn't finish the question. "Yes," one of the deputies said. "I'm sorry. But we also found evidence of other victims. This is now a major crime scene." Gwen was still studying the wooden fragment. "May I?" she asked Thomas, who handed it to her carefully. She held it up to the morning light, examining the symbols more closely. "These markings, they're protection symbols, specifically against what my grandmother's generation called the hunger that wears faces." "What does that mean?" Laurel asked. Thomas sat down heavily on our overturned cooler, suddenly looking every one of his 72 years. "It means I should have told you girls the truth about this forest a long time ago." I felt something cold settle in my stomach. "What truth?" "My brother Eric disappeared in these woods in 1962, Thomas said. "He was about your age, camping with friends. They found his campsite destroyed, just like this. Found his body 3 days later in an old logging cabin carved up like what you described. The other boys were never found." Gwen nodded grimly. "There are records going back 5 generations. Young people, usually camping or hiking alone or in small groups, always during certain times of year, always in the deeper forest areas." "But what is it?" I asked. "The scientific term would be mimic predator," Gwen said. "Something that can perfectly imitate human voices, human appearance, even human memories. My great-grandmother called it Wendigo, but that's not quite right either. It's older than the Wendigo stories, more localized." Thomas stood up and walked to the edge of our clearing, staring into the forest. The mining operations that started in the 1890s disturbed a lot of old burial sites, areas that had been marked as dangerous for centuries. The elders tried to warn the mining companies, but white people don't listen to native warnings about spiritual dangers, Gwen finished with bitter accuracy. So this thing, Laurel said slowly, it's been killing people for over 100 years. It goes dormant for long periods, Gwen explained, sometimes decades. Feeds, then retreats somewhere deep underground to digest and sleep. The pattern suggests it needs to consume several people before it can sustain itself for the next cycle. I looked at the wooden fragment in Gwen's hands. And those carvings protect against it? Your grandmother's grandmother was a very wise woman, Gwen said to Thomas. She must have known you'd need this someday. Thomas looked confused. My grandmother never gave me anything like that. Then where did it come from? I asked. Gwen smiled for the first time since arriving. Sometimes protection finds us when we need it most. The important thing is that it worked. You're both alive. The deputy with the radio came over to us. Sheriff wants to know if you girls are ready to give formal statements, and the forensic team is requesting any additional details about the interior of the house. I looked at Thomas, then at Gwen. Will anyone believe us about what we actually saw? Thomas put his hand on my shoulder. The physical evidence speaks for itself. Peter's death, the other remains we found, the ritualistic arrangement of the scene. Whether people believe the explanation or not, doesn't change what happened. The official report will focus on the facts that can be documented, the deputy added. A dangerous individual or individuals luring victims to an isolated location. The other details can remain part of your personal account. Gwen was wrapping the wooden fragment carefully in a piece of soft cloth from her satchel. I'd like to study this more closely, if you don't mind. There might be additional protections we can put in place. Additional protections? Laurel asked. This feeding cycle has been interrupted, Gwen said grimly. The creature didn't get what it needed. It might try again sooner than usual, or it might retreat for now. Either way, we need to be prepared. Thomas was looking at me with an expression I'd never seen before. Part pride, part guilt, part something that might have been fear. What? I asked. You did exactly what Eric couldn't do, he said quietly. You survived. You found a way to fight back. The helicopter was circling overhead again, probably bringing in more forensic equipment. Soon this whole area would be crawling with investigators, and our nightmare would become someone else's case file. But as I watched Gwen carefully tuck the wooden fragment into her satchel, I realized this wasn't really over. Whatever was out there in the deep forest, whatever had been hunting people for over a century, it was still alive, still hungry. And now it knew we'd gotten away.